চরণ তলে একলা দলরে যদি তোর ডাক শুনে কেউ না আসে তবে একলা চলো রে যদি আলো না ধরে ওরে ওরে ও আলো না ধরে যদি ঝড় বাদলে আধার রাতে দুয়ার দেয় ঘরে তবে বজ্রানলে আপন বুকের পাঁজর জ্বালিয়ে নিয়ে একলা চলো রে আপন বুকের পাঁজর জ্বালিয়ে নিয়ে একলা চলো রে যদি তোর ডাক শুনে কেউ না আসে তবে একলা চলো রে একলা চলো একলা চলো একলা চলো একলা চলো রে
Hi guys, thank you for joining the live stream. So today we are going to check out this female economist called Shruti Rajagopalan. The first time I heard of her was a few days back when a libertarian guy mentioned her in our stream, and he said that she said that her podcast is the best podcast on economics in the country. So today I thought of checking her out and found many of her amazing appearances in very underrated podcasts where she's getting views of like 500 views and 800 views. This one is a topic that we discuss all the time. This is a very, very significant topic in India's history. So what was India like before 1991 and after 1991? So that's where we'll start. And the girl who's asking her the question seems to be a very giddy fangirl. Her reactions are very sweet, to say the least. So thank you guys for joining. Who are here? Retrowave, no cam, yes. Good evening, Retrowave. Thank you for the compliments about the song. Abid Zain, why did you remove? That was a bit much, I think. Yes. So hi Rishi. Okay, people are joining. Let's start then, guys. Ram Rishabh. And coming back as soon as possible with the rest of the Barclay book, probably in the night, or I don't know, maybe tomorrow.
You're listening to How India's Economy Works, hosted by journalist and author Pooja Mehra.
Hello, I'm Pooja Mehra. The one request I receive most often from listeners is for episodes on the 1991 reforms. Young listeners want to know what's the big deal about them. Not too young listeners want to know why India hasn't ever managed to repeat the success. Covering everything about the 1991 reforms will take several episodes. For a start, we have on the show today Dr. Shruti Rajagopalan, who leads a project that has recorded hundreds of hours of interviews with nearly 50 actors involved in various capacities with the 1991 reforms. Shruti is a senior research fellow at the Kolkata Center at George Mason University, where she leads the Indian Political Economy program. She also hosts the Ideas of India podcast.
Yes, Rishabh, where we ended today. Oh my God, that shocked me to my very bones. Again, those of you who are not our members, I hope you read the book by Dr. Janki Bakle or take the live stream and listen to us discussing bits and sections of the book. It is phenomenal stuff that Savarkar has said and that Janki Bakle has unearthed. Insane things about Hindus prioritizing wrongly. Incredible. Do check out our membership live stream today's.
Hi, Shruti. Thank you for coming on the show. Hi, Pooja. It's so good to be here. I've been a fan of your writing for so long that I'm so excited to speak with you. Likewise. I'm a fan of your writing and your podcast. I know that you're doing this great project on the 1991 reforms, large work of recording oral histories with the main characters and actors involved in the reforms. And I'll come to that. But before I come to that project that you're doing, I want you to tell my listeners today what your personal experience of the license Raj pre-1991 was. You've written extensively about it. So most of my listeners who were young, who weren't around before 1991, and therefore they don't know how various policies impacted and how it showed up in everyday life and business, and then how it changed. This is not one of those stories where you say, oh, in our time, we walked to school 5 kilometers every day and studied under a roadside lamp. This is all actually quite factual and people can look it up. I was born in the early to mid 80s. And when you're a kid, like let's say between 5 and 10, you don't question what's happening around you too much, right? You just feel like whatever is happening around you is the way it is. You go to the ration shop, there's a long line, right? That's just how it's always been. You know that to make a long distance call, if you have your grandparents living in Chennai while we were living in Delhi, you know you have to book what was called a trunk call, right? This was an interstate long distance call. And you know that there's a lot of rush, so you have to do it in off peak hours. And you have to basically call an operator and book something in advance. And then
That's the India so many people grew up in, those nostalgic days of poverty and beautiful community feeling. When there was a power cut, you would go out in the streets and celebrate your poverty.
they'll connect and you'll get a call back at like 11:45 at night and you'll be able to talk to your grandparents. So we didn't think differently about it. In fact, the first 5 years of my life, I didn't have a phone. Apparently, my parents had put in a request for one, but they didn't get the allotment until I was age 5. So we used the
What if the private citizens who are not socialist robots, what if they get a phone of their own and call up USA and ask them to invade India? Oh wait, that was done by the Ali brothers in the Khilafat movement, and that was supported by Mahatma Gandhi.
phone, in our neighbor's place. My grandparents, my mother's parents lived about 5 minutes away, and things like that. So again, never question this too much. Oh yes, my grandparents' place. All the people in the neighborhood, they had given my grandparents' phone numbers to all of their relatives outside of Delhi. And sometimes my grandparents would have to write small slips saying so and so will call at such and such time because there were multiple calls away. So they were, like a mini exchange for the neighborhood. Absolutely. So my grandparents kind of played that function, but the other function was played by the local kirana store, who also turned into someone, who'd receive calls and you'd pay 4 rupees and you could make a call and, so on. I mean, we were relatively privileged middle class children, not really wanting for anything. So you don't think too much about these things, right? But let me give you another example of my childhood, which is like, bicycle. So most of us who were born in the 80s, we never got new shiny bikes unless you were very rich, right? So it's a hand-me-down or, some third cousin of yours has been using it, then some second cousin, then your older sibling, then the middle sibling, then it finally passes on to you. And
do you know why this was done? So that evil capitalists don't make too many bicycles, because that could really harm the poor. What if evil capitalism's evil bicycles take away the right to be happy from a poor? We are much better without bicycles if we want poor people to be happy.
today, when I tell younger folks, my younger cousins, my nieces and nephews, depending on the decade they were born, the answer is different, So if they were born in the 90s and I asked them, how did you get your first bike? They say, oh, we just went to the store and, we drove around a couple of options and we bought. If you ask the post-2000 kids, they basically say, oh, you just order one online. But if you ask, let's say, my father, who was born in the 50s, my parents, how they got that first bike, which eventually became a hand-me-down, their story is a little bit different and it's directly linked to India's economic policy. Basically, there were massive shortages for something as basic as a bicycle, and I'm picking a bike.
Massive shortage, and that too fucking manufactured artificial massive shortages. Why? Just why? So that poor people don't feel jealousy at rich people having bikes, or that poor people will use bikes and bicycles anyway, then that will be too much in shortage, so that evil capitalists don't take over. That's what Nehru learned in London School of Economics. Okay, that's the worth. That's what his degree is worth.
Bicycle, because this is something every generation has used. Unlike a trunk call or ration shop or something, we've all ridden bikes in our channel. So my dad, it was the same thing. Like there was a long wait and a second-hand bike had to be bought. So when you ask, why wasn't he just able to purchase a regular bike? Like, were they broke? Were they poor? Was there a problem? What was going on? So, you first figure out, oh, there was a shortage of bikes, right? And again, to today's young people, if you say there's a shortage, they'll say, oh, why isn't like some startup figuring out how to start making bikes or importing bikes from abroad? And that's a very reasonable question, right? But couldn't someone just start a bike company and start making bikes? Well, actually, no. This is what we call the industrial licensing system. So this goes back to the idea of socialism, the idea that the market does not allocate resources.
I think, guys, today we basically have time to listen to 2 of her podcasts, okay? And this sentence that she just said reminded me of another live podcast that she has done, which also has less than 900 views. Okay, there also she gets into this. The host actually asks her that we never hear India as a socialist country in the discourse on economics in the rest of the world. So has real socialism really been tried in India? That's what she gets into. So we'll check out that podcast as well right after we are done with this one. And Avinav, did you do some typo? Recommend us the correct one. Okay, you said Shruti Rajagopalan's podcast with Shruti Rajagopalan. So let me know which one you are talking about. Okay.
Resources properly, and there's a lot of wastage because there's wasteful and frivolous competition, right? So if multiple bike companies are competing with each other, that's considered wasteful resources. So we don't want that kind of competition. The second part of the thinking was that markets also don't allocate equitably, right? So one is
Market doesn't allocate equitably, तो भोसरी के बिना साइकिल के बैठे रहो घर पे. And by the way, what Perfect Cell is saying here, a bit cheekily and sarcastically, I guess, but it's not entirely incorrect. Now we are pro free market, and then us saying that money that doesn't even buy happiness is going to get us a lot of hate from socialists who have the monopoly on happiness. But to be fair, think of an addict. We are not talking about all people. It's not a question of happiness or sadness in the end. Markets must let people prosper. We are talking about prosperity here. We are not really talking about the happiness sadness tangent. But just to digress a little, think of an addict. Think of someone who doesn't know how to manage money. For them, money actually harms them. Like Jordan Peterson repeatedly talks about a client of his who was, I think, who had to retire with disability. Disability being he's an addict. Whenever his disability check came in, until that day, he would be very productive. He would get sober. He would read. He would go to therapy regularly. He would search for jobs and stuff. The day his disability check hit his bank account, he would go out and spend it all on alcohol and cocaine, heroin, etc. And then he would be found in a ditch, and that's how he died in the end from overdosing by repeatedly doing this. Then think of every winner of those Kaun Banega Crorepati and Who Wants to Be a Millionaire stuff. None of them have become big time high net worth people or haven't invested their way into anything. All of them have lost their money within 5 years. Okay, so managing money itself is a different ball game.
an efficiency and waste related argument. The other is, only rich people will get the bikes, regular folks, middle class folks, poor kids won't get the bike. And do you really want a rich parent buying a bike for a 9-year-old kid as opposed to a poor daily wage laborer who needs it to get to his livelihood or, needs to get it to go to the mechanic shop? So that was the thinking behind this. So now they say, okay, we're only going to have a few bike companies because we don't want wasteful expenditure, right? And wasteful competition. So now you limit the number of people who can start the bike company. The whole system begins here.
You want to give preference to capital intensive industries.
So you're so right. It's so tightly linked to that. So it's linked to bicycles in a slightly tangential way. So let's say you need to start a bike shop. What do you need to do? You're in an industrial licensing system where the government will decide how large your firm can be, where it can be located, what kind of technology it can use, how much output it will produce, what will be the employment to capital ratio, what will be the size of investment, and so on. So it's extraordinary how many details were fixed. Now, let's say that you are lucky and you got this license. Okay, so you are
lucky and you get the license to do stuff in the society.
One of the lucky few entrepreneurs who got it. Now, the other part of it was, which you just alluded to,
the guy who will actually do stuff, consume products, and contribute to the economy by consuming or by producing, is the one at most threat, is the guy who's getting punished.
The vision was, we're not going to be a country of petty labor. The idea was that we will be a very sophisticated, extremely industrialized economy, which will be modern. And the focus was capital industry because, again, resources are scarce. And the Nehruvian point of view was regular industry like bicycles, we can rely on the private sector. But for heavy industry, right, iron and steel and things like that, aluminum, we need to make sure that the government invests in this. So now the thing is, iron and steel and aluminum were completely government owned and controlled. I think TISCO was the only exception, and that's because it predates the government, the Union of India. right? It was grandfathered in.
And ironically, it's the first integrated steel plant in all of Asia. And they were the biggest suppliers to the British during the World Wars.
Exactly. And, of course, there were connections and, GRD, Tata and Nehru had a relationship. So they got grandfathered in, but no one could start a new iron and steel industry. This was just reserved only for the government, right? So now, how does this link to my dad's bicycle problem? Now, you need inputs, right? You need steel, you need iron, you need aluminum. All of this is centrally controlled. So when the government says that we're going to control iron and steel, what that actually means, in nuts and bolts, sorry for the pun, but what that actually means, in a working system is they're going to decide how much quantity of iron and steel is produced, what quality will be produced, and where it will be allocated. Because, from a safety pin to heavy industry to bicycle to eyeglasses to surgical medical equipment, you need steel. Now, they are going to decide what kind of grade of steel and how much will be produced. So now a bicycle manufacturer, by the way, who already managed to get the license to set up the bicycle shop, now needs a permit to get the steel allocation. And then the same thing for aluminum and the same thing for everything else that goes into a bicycle. Sorry, I'm not familiar with the details of how a bicycle is made to the last point. Now you may say, again, when I talk to young people, and this is literally my experience in the classroom, they're like, couldn't they just import it? Well, not exactly, because part of this system was, some of it is colonial hangover, some of it is the Soviet experiment that India was kind of trying out.
Yeah.
But India decided to be an autarkic state, which means that it wouldn't expose itself to global trade. And here we can't really blame, just Nehru and the central planners. The orthodox view at the time very much was.
Yeah, this though we get, I think, even everyone from Netaji to Savarkar, everyone was against opening up the economy because they had just got rid of someone who had come doing business in India and then decided to try settler colonialism in India. So I guess them not allowing foreign business at least moment, we could understand their cute emotions.
Is that developing countries should be protectionist. They need to protect their own infant industries and so on and have import substitution. And developed countries can be part of the free trade environment because they can handle the competition. So now there are three.
And the fact that competition in fact breeds fucking quality, वो किसी के दिमाग में नहीं घुसा.
Policies which are linked. One is import substitution. That is, you're going to have very, very high tariffs and you're going to protect local industries.
Because to be fair, even if you do in the end argue that even infants are infants can't really compete with grown-up human beings. So you can't maybe compare an infant company with a grown-up company. So even then we did not. It's not like we were at the expense, at the mercy of only infant companies. We had Tata and Bajaj and stuff. Even they were made insulated. They were protected from the rest of the world's economy and businesses and from competition because they had understandings.
Which is TISCO and the government-owned iron and steel industries. The second part of it is that you're going to have import licenses. Now, even after all this, there are going to be some things which obviously India does not produce or India does not have a natural endowment. So you're allowed to import it, but you need to go back to Commerce Ministry and you need to get an import license specific to import that good. And separately, there's a foreign exchange shortage because the rupee was overvalued, which means you need to get a separate foreign exchange allocation, right? And that will be an amount that is given to you for a particular use and you can't use it for any other use. So now we know that you have to wait in line outside the government or TISCO's shop to get your iron and steel. You can't import it, right? So now what ends up happening? And by the way, I'm so far still talking about a single input for a bicycle. I'm just talking about the metal, right? Now, there are so many other inputs that go in. I mean, there is coal that is required. There's electricity that is required. You need telephone lines to actually communicate with different parts of the enterprise and so on. I'm not even looking at all that. I'm looking at one product, which is a regular bicycle, and I'm looking at one input for that one product. So this is the extent or the detail to which this was done. Now, consequence of all this craziness is basically you can't produce enough bikes because first you don't have enough people in.
So in the end, you don't even have the bikes. You do rent control, supply of housing decreases. You control anything artificially from the state side, you lose the supply of that product, and then you artificially do job security, casteism happens.
Entering the bike manufacturing system, and even the ones who enter are restrained, at a permit and license level for every single thing. And
Yeah.
we're not, by the way, I'm also not talking about credit, which was controlled, right? Because at some point nationalized all these banks. So I'm just talking about a very limited amount. So as a consequence, bicycles there was an extreme shortage. India's demographic was becoming younger in post-colonial terms. It was urbanizing. Young men looking for work or moving to urban areas started using a bicycle. It's not your grandfather's story of we walked 5 kilometers to go to school. My father's story is we bicycled 5 kilometers to school. That's where we are, right? Now, we know, Econ 101 is if your supply is not going to be able to respond to this increased demand for bicycles, the prices are going to shoot up. But in a socialist economy, we can't let a private bicycle manufacturer profit from the system.
Socialist economy. So, guys, socialism has in fact been tried in India, and it's not a right-wing, far-right, patriarchal viewpoint. And by the way, we can't allow bicycle manufacturers to profit because गरीब लोगों का क्या? हाँ? गरीब लोगों को खाना नहीं मिल रहा है और आप बाइसाइकिल बना के प्रॉफिट करेंगे?
How is that allowed? Which means, in addition to all of these controls, you have price control. So you have controlled the price and quantity of every single input. You have both deliberately and inadvertently controlled the output, which is bicycle. And now you have to control the price of bicycle.
Ish.
So this is where we've reached.
Oh yeah, this part does not have audio for some reason. We'll fast forward. I guess our mic.
Now it
Right.
got crazier and crazier. This wasn't there, I'm pretty sure this wasn't there in my time, but I think still in my dad's time, because there was this bicycle, control. There was a shortage and then there was a price control. The government wanted to make sure that all the available bicycles were used, right? So no one's just buying a bicycle and keeping it at home and saying, I'll ride for exercise 1 hour in the evening. Which meant that after you managed to acquire this bicycle, owning and riding the bicycle required a government issued token or a little permit, which you needed to renew every year.
Aha.
Right? If you didn't renew it, then your traffic cop could catch you. Because now, only so many
The beautiful India that our leftists grew up in, that they miss.
bicycles in the economy, right? So we have to optimize and utilize. Utilization was a very big thing that you would find. And now because of this, by the time we get to 91, in the 80s, there was what they called broadbanding, which basically said that, if you're making men's bicycles, now you can also make children's bicycles. And you don't need an additional permit for that. So they allowed, these kinds of minor things in the late 80s. So by the time I was born and I was growing up, it was a little bit easier to get a bicycle. But my older sister, my older cousins, they all got this as hand-me-downs from each other. And, it's literally like it became a family heirloom. And nobody thinks of a bicycle as a family heirloom. So this was sort of life before 91. And also, bicycle again feels like a very, oh, you're a kid, you want a bicycle. But, even basic things like poor people struggled outside ration shops to get their rice and kerosene and dal, all the most basic things.
So even rich people, the kind of mountains you had to move if you wanted to buy a car.
Oh, wow. Yes. So my family's first car was a second-hand car.
Most people. But if it was, God forbid, an imported,
Oh, yeah.
like a Mercedes or something.
Oh,
you
yeah,
had
that's
it.
like, God knows, 200% tariffs or something like that, right?
Yeah, and
200% tariffs.
then there were these agencies that were allowed only to import it, and you had to get it out of their, quota. And so it was not just for poor people or middle class people.
Yeah. No, and I'll give you a middle class example, which is the Bajaj scooter, right? The Bajaj scooter was, if there was a marker for middle class living, it was the Bajaj scooter and like a Godrej almari, right? These were like sort of some of, these literally.
Retroive, and that isn't even for today's labor laws and stuff. That's just because we want to keep good relations with Bangladesh, just because we want to, I guess, avoid war with Bangladesh, so that उनके लोगों को भी उनके लोगों के पास भी कुछ काम धंधा करने को हो एटलीस्ट, ताकि सिर्फ यहाँ पे ना आ जाए. फॉर दोज रीजंस हमारे यहाँ साउथ इंडिया में कितने सारे टी शर्ट कंपनी बंद करवा के वहाँ पे टी शर्ट कंपनी, टी शर्ट फैक्ट्री खोले गए. अब तो उसी के वो सब फिर से बंद है.
Really came in dowry when someone got married. Same thing happened with the Bajaj scooter. Rahul Bajaj wanted, expansion permit because demand was increasing. He didn't get the expansion permit. Every single other thing that I said about bicycle.
उतना connections भी काम नहीं आया. Zaumya is saying, remember when there were 2 fruits and 3 vegetables to eat and 1 film to watch. No choice paralysis. कितना बढ़िया दिन थे.
This is also true for the Bajaj. Now, the price of the Bajaj scooter is going up constantly, right? But you can't increase the price because the price is also controlled. So what happens is a second-hand Bajaj scooter, which is available immediately, that is available today, is more expensive than a first-hand brand new Bajaj scooter, which will be available 2 years from today.
It's also true of Maruti cars. My father sold his second-hand Maruti car for more than what he had bought it after using it for 8 years.
Exactly. So basically, see, markets are going to come up somewhere. If there is a demand for it, you're going to create a black market or an informal market or something. So we create a second-hand market. And at one point, this was literally a joke, right? So again, in the Indian system, you can really extract something very big when you're getting married if you're the boy's side and demanding dowry. So this Maruti car, Bajaj scooter, Godrej Almari, these sorts of things which were very sort of high demand, high preference goods, but again, same shortage problem as the rest of the economy, like nuts and bolts and kerosene. They started becoming dowry demands because you can't refuse.
Ish.
So the joke eventually became, past a point, it became like an 8 or 9 year wait for a Bajaj scooter, like a regular
Lol.
Bajaj scooter. And when a daughter was born, people would come and say congratulations and tell the father, please book the Bajaj scooter today. By the time she's old enough to get married, you'll get your allot. And by the way, all this, most of the instances I'm narrating are in my lifetime. Maybe not that bicycle token, which
I guess the same infant mortality argument that they are new companies, therefore they need them. But I'll never understand why. I mean, of course, I understand the argument why, but I'll never understand why that's a good argument. I think everyone should be responsible for their own money and their own loans. Why should people who are not being asked consent before parting with their money as taxes, why should their funds be spent on people, on other people starting businesses or handling businesses? No subsidies and no MSME capital.
was my dad's lifetime. But this Bajaj scooter, the second-hand Maruti, this is all happening in the 80s still. Waiting 5-6 years for a telephone line, all of this was going on in my lifetime. And because of this, as you pointed out, basically the economy just stagnated, right? You're artificially strangling any kind of growth that can take place because all the growth has to be tightly controlled and only allowed by the government. So now anything that can be done outside of the government is either going to be driven into the smuggling market, informal market.
Yeah, anytime you ban stuff, there will be a black market for that.
Today, when we think about bootleggers and smugglers, it's mainly to do with drugs. Or if you're in a prohibition state like Gujarat and Bihar, then maybe alcohol. In our times, like a Walkman, you needed to know a smuggler.
Yeah, for those of you who all live in North Bengal, I don't know if SJDA market is still famous for that, but Siliguri, Jalpaiguri, what's the full form? District administration, right? SJDA market was famous for illegally smuggled Chinese products. Fancy market in Kolkata is still famous for illegal Chinese products. I don't know if they are today, but to be fair, these days, at least in the last 3-4 years, India has been making fun, cool, nice electronic gadgets and toys and stuff. But remember, 90s kids for us, when we were young adolescents or in our teens, pre-teens, mid-teens, etc. Not pre-teens, mid-teens and stuff onwards. Every cool watch, Walkman, even Indian, then stickers and stuff, all had to come from Chinese illegal smuggling because people were not being allowed to manufacture them in India. And no one was stopping the smuggling. Then there was some MOU signing happening between a political party and a nation. So SJD market, I have happy memories of SJD market. I bought my very first watch. It was a company called Q&Q. It was waterproof and it was black. That was also bought from SJD market.
contact to get a Sony Walkman, which is how we got our, or like
Adidas shoes.
sneakers, Adidas shoes, exactly. So these are the sorts of things. Like, I mean, now these seem pretty basic, and some of this seems like a middle class gripe of, how hard it was to get like something basic. But the larger implication of this is people want things in an economy. The entrepreneurs are willing to provide it. And there is a entire sort of scaffolding of licenses, permits, controls, credit, foreign exchange, control, licensing, all of this stuff just kind of built a scaffolding around what could have grown or what could have been built or what could have happened. And only things which were outside that system managed to have even a little bit of growth, or which were completely, done and controlled by the state. This legacy is not just Nehru. Some of it goes to war controls, right? Wartime controls, they started like in the late 30s.
बार बार वॉर में फंस जाएंगे और फिर बोलेंगे ये वॉर टाइम कंट्रोल है भाई, ये सिर्फ अभी थोड़ा युद्ध होगा इसलिए थोड़ा कर दिए, अभी थोड़ा वायरस है क्या इसलिए फिर कर दिए, अभी थोड़ा मतलब हमको पुश करना है कुछ रिफॉर्म इसलिए थोड़ा सा डिक्टेटर बन गए. अगर ऐसे करने से प्रेसिडेंट सेट हो जाता है, उसके बाद भूसी के और अगला वाला पीएम कुछ चेंज नहीं करता है. वही प्रॉब्लम है सेंट्रलाइजेशन का.
30s, early 40s. And when India, gained independence, they just continued those controls because wartime controls actually translate pretty well into central planning, which is what, India was trying to implement. And then when Indira Gandhi came to power, she wanted this kind of planning, not just for a simple set of price, quantity, foreign exchange controls. She also wanted to capture what in Soviet terms was called, the commanding heights of the economy. So, all your most important input industries, which is, mining, credit, insurance, the backbone of any functioning economy, she decided that those things should also belong and come under government purview. So one by one, we went down this road. And of course, none of this works because you're not producing enough, which means you're not raising enough tax revenue, but you're also socialist as a point of view, which means you need to spend a fair bit to keep poor people in some basic essential welfare entitlements and endowments. You need to build schools. So to build anything, the government needs revenue. And revenue is a percentage of what is produced and sold, right? So if you completely contract the economy to such an extent, what that means is either the government can say, okay, we're not going to do anything, right? We're just not going to give anything to anyone. We're not going to build roads. We're not going to build schools. We're not going to give rations to poor people. Well, one, they'll lose elections. And two, if you're a non-democratic state, you'll have riots because the entire promise of socialism is that will be delivered, right? Which means that government essentially...
गारंटी दिया है तो डिलीवर हो ही जाएगा. गारंटी तो भगवान ने दिया, ऑब्वियसली डिलीवर होगा. गारंटी दिया है तो डिलीवर काहे नहीं होगा? कैसे हो सकता है कि डिलीवर नहीं होगा?
She got into a spending problem. So you're not raising enough money. I don't say produce because the government actually doesn't produce anything. Though in socialist time, they were producing everything from Lodi Hotel to modern bakery bread.
By the way, USA distributed $50 million worth of condoms in Palestine.
To everything, right? But they're not able to raise enough revenue to keep any of this afloat. Plus, because you own all these public sector enterprises which are not dictated by market forces and a profit motive, they are basically the most inefficient places, right? So nobody gets fired. It doesn't matter how costly it was to produce, a loaf of modern bakery bread or how expensive it is to upkeep Lodi Hotel. The government's just going to pay it even if there aren't enough people demanding rooms or willing to pay the room rate, which would justify that kind of expense in that location. So between the socialist welfare spending and the government inefficiency, deficits went out of control. And we can have a conversation about all the
government inefficiency. Who were they? Were they building temples and therefore were inefficient in their handling of the economy?
Crazy things we used to do, like automatic monetization of deficit and, things like that. But basically, government has a spending problem. The rupee weakens, but you can't let the rupee weaken too much because your imports will become too expensive, which you're already trying to control. So you artificially keep the rupee overvalued, which means you need to put in more controls for anyone who's trying to do anything in the external sector. So, this thing, I keep repeating it because it's literally...
Artificially keeping the rupee overvalued.
Everything is linked to everything in an economy and it just keeps going round and round. And then one or two things need to happen for this entire thing to unravel completely. And incidentally, in the Indian case, it was oil prices shooting up, right? oil was one of the biggest imports for India, and India used a pretty large amount of its, foreign exchange was just
तुम ऋषि हमारे लाइव स्ट्रीम में देर से आते हो 5-10 मिनट और हम उसके पहले ही सब डिस्कस कर लेते हैं सबसे इंपॉर्टेंट चीज़ है यस दिस इज व्हाट वी बिगन विद द टाइम्स व्हेन people miss the India that they grew up in, the nostalgic evenings of load sheddings, power cuts, where we would have a community gathering. At least back then, we would have community gatherings when there was load shedding. What a nicer time it was. And today, you see, because of the lack of load sheddings, there's such global warming because we are never turning our lights off, our Wi-Fi is off, and therefore we have lost our community touch. With our neighborhood, I think that's the real Sanatan electricity is when you have power cuts, so that your community doesn't get dissolved. Okay, that's what was written in Manusmriti.
reserved to buy oil and energy. And by the end of 1989, I mean, in the 70s, we know we had, oil shock and prices rose, which also led to some major problems. But in 1989, when no one expected it, suddenly there was another oil shock, and this was because of the Gulf War. So prices suddenly start going up, which means your oil bill, your oil import bill rather, just doubles and trebles in what is already a dire situation. You already have very high inflation because your deficits are now going up. So, you have double-digit deficits, you have double-digit inflation. And what that does is basically your economy is not as well rated anymore, and the rupee is not as well rated externally anymore. What that basically means is no one wants to do business with you. No one will accept a piece of paper which says that the Indian rupee is valued at whatever you say it's valued at, right? No one actually trusts that. So this is what happened by the late 80s. So this all came to bear. So, even before this, to be honest, in the 60s, there was a view that maybe we need to devalue the currency and not go in this direction. But there were a number of political issues. Indira Gandhi came to power.
Man, see, she almost talks like a female Andrew Tate. Not as fast as Andrew Tate, but no things that are extremely... the thing I was going to criticize myself for, I'm doing that already. The thing I'm so embarrassed about is doing so many ums. Okay, itna clarity of thought chahiye. And see, I shift between languages. That's a sign of lack of skills. And look how she's speaking. And for so long, it's like she's reading out of a fucking book. That's insane IQ and insane brain power and articulation power and cognitive skills. By the way, I want to pause for one to show you all one particular thing. I wanted to share these two informations. I'm sure you all know about this, but this was shared a few days back in the Indian Libertarians discussion group. See, you all can see it, right? Yeah. Wait, I'll increase the screen size. So, India's biggest bankers are alarmed. India's biggest bankers are alarmed by the worst liquidity crunch in over a decade. Tighter liquidity may lead to higher borrowing costs for banks as they compete for scarce funds in the interbank market, driving up short-term interest rates like the call money rate. This also affects their margins, which may get squeezed due to higher costs in extreme scenarios. Banks may also become more cautious about lending, prioritizing liquidity management over extending credit, which would affect the country's economic growth. Scroll down for views. Okay, so this is the news, and the thing I wanted to mainly share was in some interesting comments came in the comment section of the Libertarian discussion group. So one guy called Soham Down said something I really found interesting. This is actually an extension to what Sanjeev Sanyal has been saying for the last 2-3 years, that we have cleaned up the banks, cleaned up the banks. And see, this is what Soham Down is saying, that the first time banks have had to compete for capital with other institutions or instruments, and look at them. Look at them now. The moment you take off the shackles of protection, the moment you make people compete, that's when their competency has to come to the forefront. That's when they have to up their game. And see, they are fledgling at the moment. Another person commented that when you keep offering bad interest rates, people actually start believing it's better to donate their funds to Jane Street. Lol. And by the way, there's another thing I want to point out here, another important piece of news. Reuters has said, this is from 3 days back, India to ditch privatization plans, pour billions in state-run firms, sources say. Aha, beautiful. Don't we love this? Isn't it the only feasible thing to do? Isn't this why the Libertarian Party must not ever happen, because they will be cutting votes? So, summary: India is planning to pour in 230 to 350 million dollars in ailing Pawan Hans. Sources say government announced $1.3 billion plan to revive steel producer privatization plans of 9 state-run firms on hold, according to document. Government mopped up $998 million via stake sales in 2024-25. BME Limited, Bharat Petroleum, Housing and Urban Development Corporation. So pretty. Scroll to continue. अच्छा नीचे है, थोड़ा पढ़ लेते हैं ये. Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi is pouring billions into ailing state-run firms after slowing ambitious divestment plans that were intended to reduce the role of the state in business, according to government sources and a document reviewed by Reuters. तो इसके बाद भाई संजीव सन्याल को क्या करने के लिए हायर करके रखे हो? वेस्ट बंगाल में गवर्नमेंट गिरा के संजीव सन्याल को डिक्टेटर बना दो. और what the fuck is the point of Sanjeev Sanyal in the government right now? Less than a month into 2025, New Delhi has plans to invest about $1.5 billion in financial rescue packages for 2 state-owned firms after failing to sell them to private companies. और भोसरी वालों, हम इसका प्रोटेस्ट करने जाएंगे, राइट विंग में भी प्रोटेस्ट करने जाएंगे, अलग दूसरे राइट विंगर आके बोलेंगे this is not just feasible right now. It has also decided to put in abeyance privatization of at least 9 state-owned units after opposition from relevant ministries, according to a document that detailed recommendations of a government panel set up to identify privatization candidates. The document, reviewed by Reuters, did not cite reasons for the decision. Reason का है cite करना है? Feasible नहीं है तो भोसड़ी का नहीं है. The 9 companies include Madras Fertilizers, Fertilizer Corp of India, MMTC, NBCC, the document showed. Housing and Urban Development Corp, that was also identified for privatization, has now been exempted, implying it will not be sold, according to the document, because garib logo ke paas khane ko nahi hai. Among the state-owned companies being revived with government funding is helicopter operator Pawan Hans. The government is planning to infuse around $230 to $350 million in Pawan Hans to modernize its aging fleet of helicopters after 4 failed attempts to sell the company. कोई खरीदा ही नहीं, इतना चूतिया company है. The amount of infusion is still being finalized, as options being considered for fleet modernization include both outright acquisition and leasing, one of the sources said. The sources declined to be identified because of the sensitivity of the issue. India's finance and civil aviation ministries did not immediately reply to emails seeking comment on the privatization plans or on the Pawan Hans investment, क्योंकि feasible नहीं है. The fund infusion in Pawan Hans and plans to halt the privatization of 9 firms have not been previously reported. In 2021, क्या दिन आ रहे हैं? In 2021, Modi's government announced a major program to privatize most of India's state-run companies. The plan was so drastic that even in the 4 sectors that India sees as sensitive, such as telecoms and banking, it wanted to keep only a minimum presence while exiting from all other sectors. And then there was a people just started feeling brave enough, courageous enough to at least say that capitalism is good. There were Ben Shapiro videos, Thomas Sowell videos going viral all over the world 2020 onwards. Then Sanjeev Sanyal happens. He goes around saying proudly that I won't even use words like divestment, etc. I will unapologetically say that yes, we are privatizing business and stuff. Then 4 years later, here we are. But now it is planning to rescue and revival plans for companies even outside the sensitive sectors are feasible. Last week, the government announced $1.3 billion plan to revive debt-laden steel producer Russia Ispat Nigam Limited. The government has also allocated 80 billion rupees in 2024-2025 for bond repayments of state-run telco MTNL that has seen a series of defaults lately. तो अब तो सरकार को कुछ करना चाहिए. According to budget documents for the current year. What the fuck are we going to defend this government on in terms of economics anymore? Privatization slowdown. 4 years since the privatization policy was announced, the Modi government has had only 3 successes, out of which Air India's sale to the Tata Group was the largest. The 2 other indirect holdings in steelmaker Nilachal Ispat Nigam Limited to Tata Steel and Ferroscrap Nigam to Konoike Transport Company. Other large sales have either been deferred or delayed. The U-turn in policy was partly driven by the expectation that some large state-owned firms could be overhauled and made more profitable, helping the government earn dividend income, Reuters has reported previously. Political pressures on Modi have increased after he came back to power in mid-2024 only with the help of regional allies who are apparently, supposedly more capitalist than Modi, making it more difficult to overcome opposition to privatization by employee unions fearing job losses. Great future ahead, guys. Great future. The sale of state refiner Bharat Petroleum Corp was rolled back in 2022 after failing to get suitors. No one wanted to buy that. The ongoing privatization of Shipping Corp of India and BEML has been stuck for years due to complications over transfer of land holdings. The government has also been dragging its feet on the sale of a majority stake in IDBI Bank. In previous years, privatization formed an important part of the government's plan to reduce its budget gap, but with the federal fiscal deficit seen falling to a more comfortable 4.9% of GDP in the 2024 through 25 year, the fiscal push for divestment has waned. तो हमने अभी थोड़ा fiscal deficit कम कर लिया है, तो अब चलो फिर से बढ़ाते हैं. New Delhi is expected to miss its internal stake sale target of 180 billion to 200 billion rupees in 2024-2025 for the sixth year straight. As of January, government has mopped up 86.25 billion rupees via stake sales. Okay, yeah, हो गया. This is the report. Let's get back to the video now. Where did it go? Oh, हाँ, यहाँ पे है. Sad shit.
We need to devalue the currency and not go in this direction. But there were a number of political issues, you say it's valued at, right? No one actually trusts that. So this is what happened by the late 80s. So this all came to bear. So, even before this, to be honest, in the 60s, there was a view that maybe we need to devalue the currency and not go in this direction. But there were a number of political issues. Indira Gandhi came to power. She was advised by a number of very, very socialist, extreme left of center people like P.N. Huxter. Also, she was trying to differentiate herself from the rest of the party and trying to gain power. So, there was a slightly more pro-market, pro-liberalizing wing of the party, and Indira Gandhi decided to go the other way. So in 1966, when there was a Bell Mission.
हमारा ट्रिस्ट विथ सेक्युलरिज्म और हमारा ट्रिस्ट विथ प्राइवेटाइजेशन या कैपिटलिज्म सेम तरह का ही है. कभी कभी अचानक से कुछ लोग आ जाते हैं, हिंदू मुस्लिम यूनिटी का थोड़ा बहुत होने का चांस होता है, फिर से कोई भोसरी वाला आके उसका गाड़ मार देता है. Like if Darashiko was able to have his way, we would have probably a very different India today. If Ali Mia was listened to and people gave up the Ram Mandir readily, we would probably have a different India today. If Indira Gandhi listened to the other side, we would have a different country today. If Vallabhbhai Patel or Netaji Subhash or even Savarkar became the PM, I don't think they would be so crazily blind to feedback loops as Nehru, Indira Gandhi were, and go on screwing the country in the name of socialism. Because remember, Lee Kuan Yew was also a socialist to begin with, but he saw the feedback on the ground and decided, no, fuck this, socialism in name only, bro, let's do capitalism. Same with China today. But ideologically hardened and devout socialists screwed the country. And I don't think Savarkar, Netaji, Vallabhbhai Patel, all of them would have done those things. Abhinav, equally.
There was a possibility, a tiny possibility that India might actually start decontrolling a little bit, liberalize, adjust its currency a little bit. That never happened. But in 1989, things were really dire. And what are you going to do?
So now we have some understanding
What are you going to do? Ab kya kare?
of how the economy was and what triggered the 1991 crisis. There are many other things, some of which I think listeners would be aware of, the political crisis, etc. And then what was done to slowly begin to fix this and how it links to each one of these examples that you've given.
So you also talked about the political crisis. So, in 1989, Rajiv Gandhi lost the election, right? He was like a big front runner. He had won by huge majority when he had actually come to parliament. But between the Beaufort scam and a number of other things and sort of like a stagnating and a messy economy, high inflation, all the things we talked about, Rajiv Gandhi actually loses the election and VP Singh, manages to stitch together a coalition. It's the strangest coalition supported by communists and BJP peoples, the far left, far right, everyone kind of stitches together this coalition. Now, VP Singh is actually quite an interesting person. And now, when we talk to some of the people who worked with him, was apparently very open-minded. I wouldn't go so far as to call him pro-market or pro-reform-minded, but clearly there was a reckoning that something had gone horribly wrong. And the promise that was made to the Indian people of economic prosperity and rising out of what their parents and grandparents had suffered in colonial times had really not been delivered. So he was quite open, and he was open to ideas and, thought that he could maybe be the person who gets India out of this crisis. And there were also people in his government who started working on putting together something, that would help eventually get India out of the crisis. In fact, Montek Singh Ahluwalia's famous M document was written during this time of VP Singh's government. I believe it was even introduced as a cabinet note and so on. But VP Singh spent a lot of his political capital trying to get caste-based OBC reservations. This was based on the Mandal Committee.
Was inclined to believe in the market, was open-minded, but decided let's do more reservations.
Report. So this was, again, India was rioting, middle class, upper caste people were rioting, as well as Dalits were rioting, saying that, they shouldn't take our share of the pie. So they decided to go with the Mandal formula of, you will have your scheduled caste reservation, you'll introduce, there was scheduled tribe reservation, and now 27% reservations will be introduced for other backward classes. But this was something on which VP Singh spent pretty much all his political capital and couldn't quite get the reforms done, right? And also was unable to deal with, communal riots. There were so many things going on, in 1989 was just a crazy year. And this instability led to a next government being formed within a year. VP Singh's government barely lasted 11 months, right? So Chandrasekhar comes and he forms another minority government. Now, this government was actually incidentally with the support of Congress, which was led by Rajiv Gandhi. Rajiv Gandhi decided that they'll support it from outside. And his finance minister was Yashwant Sinha, right? Who later also served under Vajpayee, as we know. But this time, Yashwant Sinha had a tiny, really short tenure as finance minister. And he also was market-oriented and had decided that, we need to figure out a plan that will actually address all these different problems. We need to cut the fiscal deficit, like in a very serious way. We need to think about what's going on with the currency and, reevaluate or rather devalue the currency. And we need to figure out a bunch of other, economic policies which will bring some kind of macroeconomic stability. In fact, I believe later in his memoirs,
OBC reservation will get you macroeconomic stability.
Yashwant Sinha wrote that whatever Manmohan Singh announced many months later in 1991, there were very similar policies that were already in play that he was thinking of doing and so on. But again, this government didn't have enough, political and social capital to do any of this. There were some other crazy things that were going on. Rajiv Gandhi.
हाँ, ये फालतू का नॉस्टैल्जिक रेटोरिक है. तब के हीरोज थे इन लोगों के बचपन में. देखो ये प्राइम मिनिस्टर ने, ये देखो थोड़ा एक दो ड्रॉप ऑफ रिफॉर्म तुम्हारे मुंह पे थोप दिया, देखो कितना बढ़िया है. So that kind of thing. So it's just hero worship of her childhood days that she's describing.
Gandhi pulled support from the government. But meanwhile, the only thing that Yashwant Sinha managed to do was secure a loan from agencies abroad to get enough reserves to actually pay the import bill, right? So this was now such a dire situation that, you don't, like imagine a family that doesn't have money to buy rations for dinner day after tomorrow. There's enough food today, there's some food tomorrow, but day after, we have absolutely no money left, right? So I believe the number was we had enough reserves, foreign exchange reserves, which are dollar denominated, to buy about 40 days worth of imports at that current run rate. So, there was a plan that there's going to be some economic reforms. We're going to talk to the IMF. We're going to try and get a loan and so on. But Sinha was running out of options. There were no reforms done. So basically, he sold some of India's gold. And now this, I think, an average person understands. If you need to sell gold, which is literally, family heirlooms, to make sure that you can buy enough oil or kerosene to survive the next week or the next month,
Run the kitchen fires.
Exactly. So that was exactly.
The giddy fangirl has spoken again. But what Polymerist is saying here, I don't entirely agree, because Sanjeev Sanyal wouldn't even be effective in a think tank, because think tank से भी वो बोलेंगे government में तो कोई सुनने वाला है नहीं. So yeah, if you say he could just go on publishing activist materials that we could use to debate and stuff, yeah, that could work. But best would be if he becomes a full-time activist, not on the streets and stuff, but builds narrative and stuff, starts his own podcast, discusses economics and pushes the narrative and stuff. Those things could benefit.
Exactly the one-on-one parallel for India, which is you need to start selling gold from India.
Yeah, maybe Avinav, what happened with Vivek in terms of pissing people off, maybe that happened with Sanjeev Sanyal as well. They have the same vibe. So maybe the poverty of aspirations equals to people looking for government jobs. वो बोलने के बाद से शायद उनका बात सुनना थोड़ा कम हो गया गवर्नमेंट में.
Meanwhile, the government falls is an interim government. There is a major sort of political campaign that's unfolding.
Sanjeev Sanyal could do that, because a lot of these Bengali, the Rantak Pakhos claim to be capitalists, but if Sanjeev Sanyal starts speaking Bengali, they would flip it once again, because I have heard Sanjeev Sanyal, although when I spoke to him in Bengali, I think his Bengali has improved much more, but when I heard him speak in Bengali on Republic Bangla 2 years back, that would make Rantak Pakhos commit suicide.
And Rajiv Gandhi gets assassinated. This happens in Tamil Nadu. This is the LTTE planned assassination. And suddenly, India is in disarray, right? Because we've had two very short-lived coalition governments.
By the way, he is already the VP right now. No, he's looking for a vice chancellor. He's the chancellor of Jindal or GIP नाम का एक जिंदल का कुछ international. Wait, I'll Google and stuff. एक university का chancellor बनाया गया है उनको. Wait, I'll Google and let you all know.
We've had caste-related riots, communal riots. You've had a major political assassination by what then came to be known as a terrorist group. And you have an economic crisis that has never been seen before in post-colonial India. So that was sort of the situation. And now the Congress party won the maximum number of seats, but not enough for its majority. And there's no clear successor to Rajiv Gandhi. So there's some nice, interesting political history to this. There are a number of books written, especially, Vinay Sitapati's biography of P.V. Narasimha Rao. And
yeah, Polymerist, we've already done a live react on one of their episodes. It's called, I called my live stream, the best podcast on Indian, in India, question mark देके हमने live react किया था.
P.V. Narasimha Rao has been a very long time congressman. He's been a chief minister. He's been a Lok Sabha member. He's been a foreign minister under Rajiv Gandhi's government and so on. So, sort of one of those long-time Indian politicians and parliamentarians becomes what they call a compromise candidate, to lead this minority cup. And Rao is sworn in. And I believe his first thought was to get I.G. Patel as his finance minister. And, he was sort of looking into it. But I.G. Patel was already very senior by then. And I think he was retiring from political and technocratic life. And I believe I.G. Patel and a couple of others suggested Dr. Manmohan Singh as the finance minister candidate to P.V. Narasimha Rao to really arrest this crisis. And some of this also came from the bureaucratic ranks. Naresh Chandra, who was his cabinet secretary as soon as he took office, apparently asked Naresh Chandra, is the economic situation that bad? When he was briefed on all this. And apparently Naresh Chandra said, no, sir, it's actually much worse than what you've been told. So there was an immediate understanding that the first thing that needs to be done is to arrest this crisis. Otherwise, the Indian currency, the rupee will default, basically. So that was the idea. Now, the most interesting thing that Narasimha Rao managed to do was actually find the right people. We rarely associate economic crisis as an HR problem. Step one of Narasimha Rao was actually, what is the team? This is an HR problem. Who's going to be in which part of the government? And a second part is, even though...
That's what I think should be the short-term goal in the near future for Libertarian Party of India as well. If they at all get serious about putting up candidates and stuff, and maybe hire Sanjeev Sanyal, ask him to head the party after his tenure with the government is over at least. because unless you build up a strong base for yourself, BJP is not going to respect you. And everyone should agree, I think, that BJP wanted to do stuff. They are just succumbing to certain voter blocks. So why aren't we going to be a voter block ourselves and challenge the government as well? So if the government listens to threats to other groups of voters, why not us as well? So someone has to build up a pressure group, and then in the end, we can think of supporting the India and stuff. But we have to get to a negotiation table with some strength. We can't beg the government on Twitter by being inside the ecosystem. They're not going to listen to us.
Though there was a reckoning, Montague's M document had been doing the rounds, right? There had been multiple reports since the late 70s, and we can get in more into that, where government report after government report had said, we need to deregulate cement, we need to deregulate sugar, we need to deregulate this, we need to liberalize trade. But they were all scattered all over the place. But there was an increasing awakening within the bureaucratic and technocratic class.
पहली बात तो है, कास्ट में तुमको डूमो को छोड़ना पड़ेगा. डूमो को छोड़ने के लिए पढ़ना पड़ेगा. और डूमो का अगर ऑपोजिट कुछ बनाते हैं तब तो बोलते हैं कि 1947 से वो ब्रिटिश आने के पहले कास्टिज्म नहीं हुआ था. तो थोड़ा तो अब पढ़ना पड़ेगा कुछ लोगों को, या फिर जिन लोगों ने पढ़ लिया है उन लोगों को एकदम सामने डाल देना होगा. तब ग्राउंड कनेक्शन और वो मतलब फ्लड के टाइम पे कितना कंट्रीब्यूट किया था वो देख के तुम लीडर ढूंढोगे तब तो नहीं होगा. अरे व्हाई द फक शुड आई केयर अबाउट इफ माय प्राइम मिनिस्टर हेल्प्ड इन द फ्लड और नॉट? वो काम तो गवर्नमेंट का है, या फिर कोई प्राइवेट डिजास्टर मैनेजमेंट टीम को दो. विवेक रामास्वामी ने फ्लड में काम किया है यूएसए में, या फिर हरिकेन में जाके सोशल वर्क किया है? उस बेसिस पे विवेक रामास्वामी या ट्रंप को चूज किया जा रहा है. अजीब चुतियापा है हमारे यहाँ.
That something needs to be done. But the entire political class and half the bureaucrat.
And Rishabh, that should come under Libertarian Party of India or in somewhat similar groups. I am not endorsing the party directly. I don't know who it's run by, but there has to be a similar block. I think that block should unite under some umbrella.
Class, the seniors, were still the old socialist guard, right? Can't do anything too drastic. And that's why I say part of it was an HR problem. Because if you get the same old people, you're going to repeat the same old policies. You'll make the same old mistakes, right? And here now you have Manmohan Singh, who is by the time we know Manmohan Singh since he became finance minister. But even before he became finance minister, he was very, very well known and regarded because he had spent time in India, he had spent time abroad at the multilateral organizations. He had a PhD from Oxford, right? He had written, in fact, on trade and imports with Ian Little and so on.
He was chief economic advisor. He was RBI governor.
He was RBI governor, deputy governor, chief economic advisor, planning committee.
Our giddy fangirl is a fangirl of Manmohan Singh as well. She was an RBI governor.
Planning.
That's how I talk about Vivek Ramaswamy and Sanjeev Sanya.
Commission. He had held every important technocratic position in government before he became a cabinet level appointee. And, Manmohan Singh stitched together a team, and the team is really interesting. Now, A.N. Verma was the, Prime Minister's personal secretary. Then you have Naresh Chandra, who's cabinet secretary. And you have some very interesting people now, right? So, P. Chidambaram, who was, till then relatively more involved in Tamil Nadu politics, was now going to be the commerce minister, and joined by Montague Singh Ahluwalia, right? Who had written this MDoc, who was a proponent of trade liberalization, who Manmohan Singh knew from, the old days when they were in Washington, D.C. And in fact, apparently, it was Dr. Singh who had encouraged them to move back to India and serve with government. So you had Rakesh Mohan, who had already been at, the industry ministry for many years by then, right? So one by one, you start seeing, you have Ashok Desai, right? Who is not exactly chief economic advisor because that position wasn't vacant, but he was like the consultant position that had been created for the chief economic advisor. So one by one, you start seeing this very interesting group of people. And C. Rangarajan is deputy governor at RBI. Right? You have Venkati Ramanan, who is, the governor of RBI. So this team starts coming together in a very, very interesting way. And we've also heard, we've put...
Yeah, to be fair to Manmohan Singh, we must give him insane amounts of credit for doing the nuclear deal, but others to thoda sprinkling hi hai.
Put together from different sources that, Dr. Singh, who we know as a very courteous, very polite person, was actually also very strong-willed. When he had his first meeting with that big team of technocrats and bureaucrats, he said, if you have any difficulty with the proposed reform program, we can find other things for you to do, which is again an HR problem, right? We can move you to a ministry where you're not going to be such a pain. We can move you to rural development or something. But in industry, commerce, finance, you need people who are sort of liberal minded, so to speak. So this was what was going on. So the absolute number one thing that was done, and this was done within a few days of taking office, was the devaluation, right? So this was really, really important. The rupee actually needed to reflect its true value to be taken seriously by anyone who was willing to trade with, others on the rupee. So the first thing was the devaluation. And this devaluation was done in an interesting way. They decided that the rupee was overvalued by, say, about, 20%. And we need to devalue the rupee in some, reasonable way. If you do all 20% at, in one shot, or maybe more than 20% in one shot, the markets will go in the toilet and the world will overreact and the rupee is going to have a different kind of crisis. So the plan was that, there'll be a two-step devaluation program. And of course, devaluation and these things are managed by the RBI. So, the RBI and finance ministry work in tandem, but not everything is actually done and controlled by the finance ministry. This was entirely the RBI's domain. So they had put together, Dr. Singh had, put together a plan. There was a handwritten note sent to Narasimha Rao that, there's going to be this two-step devaluations, things like that. And on July 1st, right, they'd taken office in, end June, within under 10 days. Within 8 days, I think, of taking office and being sworn in, he devalued the rupee by about 7 to 9%, right? This is mostly back channels and it happened.
Probably difficult for people to imagine. See, Dr. Rangarajan writes in his memo, which just came out last year, that every day in the morning he used to set the rupee exchange rate because it is not a floating currency. And that's also not easy, right? Because you got to pull together a bunch of different factors. You got to figure out what are the exports and imports looking like this week? What's happening in the rest of the world? Is there a war? Are we importing more or less oil? Because, now there's an oil shock. So it was actually a really, really tough thing to do. And you're absolutely right. It's crazy that it had to be done by like a small group of human beings. Now, having said that, if there's one person in the world I would trust to get it right, it is Dr. Rangarajan. But no one should be in the...
It is Dr. Rangarajan. She is also giddy. They are all fangirls, criticizing socialism a little, but mainly fangirling.
Position to actually have to set this rate, right? So after Dr. Rangarajan was the deputy governor, mostly managing the external sector, which is why we talk about him as opposed to the then governor of RBI. There was just hell broke loose, right? So the Congress socialist old guard goes crazy. Then you have the bureaucrats and technocrats going crazy. Of course, the markets are going crazy. And suddenly there is a feeling, remember, this is a minority government with support from outside. Narasimha Rao apparently gets cold feet and thinks that, okay, this is going to be even worse than the Chandrasekhar government. We won't even last a few months. In a few weeks, we'll be gone.
Cold feet, like Narendra Modi is getting today.
Right? So apparently he asked Dr. Singh to hold off on the second devaluation. But Dr. Singh said it's already done. And there was, again, that's another lovely story that we can talk about how, Dr. Singh and Rangarajan communicated with each other on how the plane has left or taken off. Like, you can't do anything to bring it back now. So that was step one. But, it makes no sense to just devalue the currency without actually fixing your import-export system, right? Because the point is, you have to be able to earn foreign exchange, which is what got you into this mess in the first place. And to earn foreign exchange, you need to be able to export, right? But to be able to export, you need to remove this labyrinth of crazy licenses and stuff. So another part of the reform, which came almost simultaneously, came from P. Chidambaram, which was one, encouraging exports. Then there were a number of things like exim scripts. We can talk about, the kinds of incentives they gave. There's import tariffs, which were obviously cut very, very significantly. And rethinking how this trade policy regime is going to function such that if there is more trade, then there is more opportunity to earn foreign exchange. And yes, initially people are going to get crazy and they're going to try and import things that weren't allowed in the erstwhile system. But we will give people a mechanism or trading scripts, to manage those imports and then slowly phase them out and so on and so forth. And that was a really, really important reform.
In fact, a lot of people, even when they comment on the reforms, what they don't realize is how well thought out they were in terms of
How well thought out they were. How awesome the reforms were. How brilliant, absolutely perfect, complete they were.
sequencing, and beforehand the economists were able to get, not guess, but they can analyze and see that after this step would be needed because this is what the reaction would be, and there were hardly any unintended consequences and hardly anything that they hadn't already preempted, which is why I think that the reforms succeeded. Today we see small little things, policy decisions that are taken after every 5 months or 2 months, and sometimes within days they have to be revisited because our policymakers now act first and think later. They are not able to see, what will happen one step after the other when they take a decision, how the economy will respond. And of course, like you say, it's an HR thing, the personalities, etc. But it's also because these individuals had such great understanding of the economy and economics.
Yes.
They knew what the reaction would be, and therefore
Oh my god. What the fuck is this?
what needed to be done in the sequence. Absolutely, and I would add a couple of more small things to that. Once you get past the Econ 101 stage, right, where we mostly study partial equilibriums, right? So you have the downward sloping demand curve, you have the upward sloping supply curve, and you're basically looking at very narrow settings and narrow markets where you're looking at partial equilibrium. But the economy, when we think of it, we need to think about it in general equilibrium terms, right? That is, if you do something in this part of the economy, something's going to pop up in another part of the economy, right? And that, I think, was the greatest strength that people like Dr. Singh, people like, Montek Singh Ahluwalia, Dr. Rangaraj.
It feels like I'm listening to an audiobook of Mission Impossible series. It's like Tom Cruise then comes, and the brilliant planning of Ethan Hunt, and then IMF. Oh my god. And then hamare Superman comes in, and they meet in Kashmir.
And Rakesh Mohan. These guys truly
See, it's a superhero audiobook, comic book, graphic novel being read out to me.
Understood the complexity of an economy, and they weren't like narrow experts who only understood like this one narrow part of economic functioning where they're working off like one partial equilibrium. I think the M document, its success is it's a general equilibrium thinking, right? Whereas most reforms we introduced are partial equilibrium thinking. So I think that's one important distinction. And the second thing, I cannot highlight this enough, is the sequencing, right? So if you think about it, they take office in end of June, right? Everyone's sworn into office. 1st and 3rd of July, the first thing they do is devalue. On July 4th, what's the first thing you do after devaluing? P. Chidambaram was the Minister of State for Commerce because the union minister was not very reforms friendly. The first thing they do is they dramatically reduce tariffs. Because only if you reduce tariffs will your import bill go down, and only if you import can you manufacture enough to export, and all the other things need to start happening. If you just go back before 91 for a second, except for a small list of freely tradable items, the average tariff rate was about 113 or 115%, something like that. And the highest tariff rate was 355%. It was outrageous how costly everything was to import, how impossible it was. So another part of that reform that, Chidambaram announced was they're going to open up the market and remove the restrictions for everything except 71 specified goods, with the understanding that even those will be liberalized over time. But right now, we are going to keep a list of 70. So that's the sequence, right? So now what comes after this? You have, as I said, now suddenly people are going to start importing and exporting. Do we have the capacity for that? So they had a system called canalization. They introduced, these exempt strips, which were literally, they're just vouchers, right? Which you can slowly phase out so that you don't have these crazy fluctuations. And simultaneously, they said, okay, goods and services we are able to buy, but what about foreign technology? So, A.N. Verma and P. Chidambaram, they all coordinated and said that we're going to have foreign technology agreements that will start getting permitted. So that now you can also get foreign technicians, because the next glut is going to be, now we can import the machinery, but who's going to come and install it? Right? Which you need some. So that's, what you said about it being coordinated, thought through, the sequencing, it is so right. It was so, and in high priority sectors, they started allowing foreign equity because you need FDI to come in so that, you can start getting more dollars into the economy. And so on and so forth.
Yeah.
Now, after this, still the biggest problem, as we discussed in the first part of the conversation,
was this crazy industrial licensing system. And
Right.
just like Montek Singh had put in a lot of work, starting with the VP Singh government and prepared this MDOC and so on, there was another reformer, which is Rakesh Mohan. Again, had gotten his PhD in the US at Princeton, had worked at the World Bank, had
Wow,
come
wow.
first to the Planning Commission, then the Industry Ministry. And he was advising them. And he actually literally put together a list of every single control. There's a lovely paper written by him and Vandana Arora. From 1950 to 1991, they actually traced every single crazy licensing. And then, when you're tracing this, you have to start understanding, does it make sense? Does it not make sense? What makes sense? So the next thing that was announced, all this was announced in the same month, by the way, in July, right? Between 25th June when they took office to 23rd or 24th July when, the famous budget speech by Manmohan Singh, all this was happening. So this was industrial license. All that crazy stuff about you need a permit, it's going to tell you where to set up the, the location of the bicycle industry, the quantity, how many directors you can appoint, how much employment. All of that was removed in a single stroke. And about 80% of the Indian industry was brought out of this kind of industrial licensing. I think about 18 industries, it was still kept. And there were various reasons for it. And again, with the idea that they will liberalize this eventually. And eventually, the sectors that were reserved for the state.
हाँ, और अब इवेंचुअली तो क्या हो रहा है वो तो हमने थोड़ी देर पहले एक खबर, एक न्यूज़ पोर्टल से एक न्यूज़ पढ़ लिया.
Like iron and steel and stuff like that. That was pulled back. The MRTP, which was this monopolies and restrictive trade practices, we didn't talk about that.
And reservations
Yeah.
for small-scale industries. My God, you're telling companies to remain small. You may become too
Yeah.
big for your own good.
Yeah.
Okay, so the reservations, now that we've taken this detour, we must make it. This was eventually eliminated in the Vajpayee government time. But this comes from the Nehruvian times where they said that small firms can't compete with big firms. And big firms are obviously going to invest a lot and try to get scale, and then small firms won't be able to compete. And there are certain things India is good at, cottage industries, shoes, textiles, handicrafts, small parts, spare parts. All those things we should reserve for small scale industry.
Yeah, I always say that's like saying people who play gully cricket, you're not eligible to play international cricket, even if you're very
pretty
good.
much.
Actually, it's a
Exactly.
little bit worse. It is
Good, good.
saying
Finally, some stuff. And by the way, remember, Congress supporters are pretty weird and insane when they say that we deserve credit for strangling the country, and we also deserve credit for taking the hands off of the neck of the country. Remember, they will not admit that there was in fact anything wrong that they did with the economy before 1991. But on the other hand, Manmohan Singh deserves insane amounts of credit. Narasimha Rao and Congress deserve insane amounts of credit for doing the 1991 reforms. Okay, reform. पहले वाला चीज भी बढ़िया था, reform करके भी बढ़िया था. Okay, you'll always meet some. I hate to use the word toxic because it's so bastardized these days, but you will meet some toxic people who will the forever complainers in your life. Okay, notice if this has been your observation as well. Let me know that these people will go on saying that yes, mera bhi kuch galti hai, I am wrong sometimes, but then these things are happening wrong with me. But the moment you point out something that you think they actually did wrong, that's the moment they will say, no, this was not my mistake, this is why I did that, and here are 50 excuses. But they will give the useless, pointless statutory caveat from time to time that yes, I have some faults myself as well. Yes, I do admit that, but here is why I am the victim here. Again, you go on actually pointing out any specific mistake, and then they will say, no, this was not a mistake, I had 50 excuses to do that. So that's how Congresses behave regarding pre-1991 and post-1991 India.
That cricket in the 20-over format can only be played as gully cricket. Right? That's effectively what they did, right? So you can never have a 2020 and an IPL and an international 2020 World Cup and all. If it's a 2020 format, it will only be played as gully cricket. And if you played anything other than gully cricket or you put it in a school stadium, you need an additional permit. That's kind of what they were doing. And the reasoning behind it again was that small firms won't be able to compete. which was crazy because we know from the Korean, Taiwanese, Malaysian experience that small firms, actually, that was their biggest strength, that, they were able to utilize labor and local culture and, that tradition of working with the hands for, whether it's a leather shoe or clothing or bespoke tailoring. We never managed to tap into that, right? So, but what that meant
Obviously.
was you could never get spare parts, for a bicycle
Lol.
made by a small scale firm because only certain firms could be small. And that reservation list started with, I think, 60 or 70 types of goods. And I think by the late 90s, it had over 1,000 goods included in that reservation list, which was reserved for small scale industry. So this was, anything up to 10 million, right? I mean, that's hardly any money. Rupees, by the way, not even dollars, was supposed to remain small. So small scale, reservation list was delicensed a little bit later, a few years later in Vajpayee's time. And then, of course, the full delicensing came. And then the famous budget speech was the first time a new kind of economic vision had been placed, right? So like I said before, that cement had been decontrolled in the 80s, sugar was decontrolled. Towards the end of the 80s, you had some minor trade liberalization, you had broadbanding, you had some streamlining. But even then, people kind of held on to this idea that the socialist way was still the correct way. We just need to make some tweaks and turns.
As if they don't today. As if Congress doesn't do it today.
Within that method. And Manmohan Singh's speech is the first time that you say that self-sufficiency doesn't mean socialism. It means the ability to pay your bills without selling your gold.
Nice,
right?
nice.
And to be self-sufficient, that is for Indian economy to actually be able to pay its own bills and have some value for its currency and serve its own people, you need to be integrated to the rest of the world and global markets and so on, right? So there, the biggest thing he brought in was fiscal discipline, which, as you track, we have even until today. That's kind of baked in now into Indian macroeconomic policy. They eliminated a number of public spending on subsidies and PSUs and, started sort of reducing that expenditure. There was some serious tax reform because, the tax rates were so outrageous and out of whack was, no one was paying taxes. So, you needed to bring in some sanity to actually incentivize.
Again, it's true everywhere, almost forever in humanity. If you make taxes so high, then your revenue collection actually goes down because people go out of their way to hide their taxes and send it to for Swiss bank and stuff. But on the other hand, if you make it more reasonable, then they don't go out of their way to do an illegal thing, because in doing that illegal thing, they also have to spend money, right? So instead they think that, okay, instead of doing an illegal thing and risking going to jail, instead of spending money on doing the illegal thing, why not just pay the tax legally here, and then actually revenue collection goes up.
People to pay taxes and, be in the formal part of the economy. There was some financial liberalization on how interest rates were set, both by RBI and the banks and, those sorts of things.
National Stock Exchange was set up. The capital controller went away.
Exactly. Capital controller went away. The import-export controller went away. Literally, there was a controls infrastructure which was completely dispatched.
Building in Delhi, where the Cottage Emporium is from where it was all controlled.
Exactly. Then they allowed for foreign direct investment. They allowed for technology transfers. There was a plan to start privatizing large public sector organizations and, disinvesting, which has still not been done, but, completely, but it all started then. And of course, deregulation, those sorts of things. So all these were dubbed basically, what was pejoratively dubbed the Washington Consensus, right? By John Williamson. But basically, these were the prescriptions, when the orthodoxy changed on how developing economies are supposed to do their business, it changed through the experience of the Taiwanese, Malaysians, Singapore, Hong Kong, South Korea, most importantly, was a miracle economy. And then when China liberalized, the other shoe dropped. And of course, with the collapse of the Soviet Union and stuff, the fundamental orthodoxy in the rest of the world also changed. And that's where all these prescriptions started coming. But, India's reforms were completely homegrown in the sense that they were written by Indians, pursued by Indians. Of course, there's support from IMF, World Bank. Many of the technocrats who did it had actually worked there and, had deep connections there. But it was very much led by the team and, all the people I mentioned. I'm sure I'm leaving out some names, but it was a big team. I encourage people to go look up the 1991project.com, and we have all the reformers, their stories, exactly how this happened, I have all those details up there written not just by me, but by a number of people. But it was an extraordinary thing because policy change is not easy. Pooja, you've tracked this, right? You pointed out how we do ad hoc stuff, we do demonetization, we do retroactive taxation, we do like just, suddenly there'll be like imports on laptops, import licensing for laptops, and then they'll rescind it. We do all this crazy stuff. And one of the most tricky things where the Indian economy could have really become one of those tin pot republic economies where, you just go from crisis to crisis. India has never been in that situation again where it was on the brink of economic collapse and currency crisis. It's never had that kind of crazy, situation where we're running out of reserves or where S&P and Moody's is going to devalue us. And if you notice the Latin American experience or even the South Asian experience, actually, if you look at
Or the Argentinian experience.
happened in Sri Lanka, people who are in this situation keep getting into the situation over and over and over again. And India has never been in that situation since then, which is testament to how well the first stage of reforms were conducted and how well that, stage was set. Now, if all this is getting too serious for people, again, I was only
It's
8 years
not.
old, right? I didn't go from like riding bicycles to becoming a very serious person. And, Pooja, even in my own life, I'm sure you observe this in your life, suddenly,
I didn't choose seriousness. Seriousness chose me because of socialism.
you just had Cadbury and Amul chocolate and you
Uh-huh.
could get like 10 different kinds of chocolate, right? We didn't have Pepsi growing up. We had Thumbs Up and Gold Spot and all. But, Michael Jackson drank Pepsi, which was the coolest thing to do. And suddenly you could drink Pepsi.
Shruti, you mentioned this. I still remember I was in school and there was a trailer for the advertisement for Pepsi when it was to return to India. And the entire conversation in school on that day was about this trailer for the advertisement. And then, then the advertisement would come and then Pepsi would return to it. It was such a big deal. I can't tell you.
Absolutely.
Fangirl is
No,
fangirling.
and it is a huge deal. For us, getting access to something like Pepsi or, getting a cassette of Michael Jackson, which had to be imported, right? To get access to something like that,
No, Zeroth, you are being too polite here. Idiotic and cringy, these are not the words for a retrospective tax. It's pure evil. Pure evil.
was like getting an iPhone for today's kids. Like, it was a really big deal. It was a sort of thing where you waited, you saved money and you waited and you begged your parents. And then the moment
Yeah.
you got it, you shared it with all your friends. And
Mm.
then from that one Michael Jackson tape, 15 more tapes would.
And people who say capitalism is Western propaganda and it's Western style capitalism that's destroying our family values and we must get back to a community feeling of load sheddings, they will probably say that it's that waiting that is part of Sanatan economics. That wait that you had to go through that made you a better human being, and we really miss it. See how capitalism has worsened us as human beings.
Be copied. We all had our own bootleg version of these albums or these songs. So it was an extraordinary time, but this was something that really touched everyone's lives. And my favorite
Touched. Yeah, it definitely just touched everyone's lives in the wrong parts.
example of this, and again, this is as we grow up and we think back to our lives,
It should have touched our brains. It touched us everywhere except that.
I grew up with my grandparents, the ones who had the phone and who would take messages and things. They lived about 10 minutes away, walking distance from us. So we'd spend half our school day there. After school, we'd go to Nani's place and, all of that usual stuff. For such a large part of my early childhood, my grandmother, every day, just after lunch, before dinner, would sit with one big plate of rice or a big plate of dal, raw rice, raw dal, and start removing all the impurities from it. There were these pathars and
Yeah.
kankars, typically. And I saw her doing it for years and we never questioned it because that was just how it was done. And we just assumed, there must be some impurity in it. She's removing it, to have a better meal. And I never realized that this was part of that liberalization moment, that it all went away after that. Because what happened?
And notice how after 1991, all the 90s kids and onwards have better height than all of their parents. Imagine the stunting that our parents went through, and especially Bengali families and especially Bengali refugee families, the insane height differences. And I've told you all this story before as well, guys. Right, guys, that I'm about just a little more than 5'11", not exactly 6. So and since I work out, I am almost always the tallest and the most gigantic looking guy in every neighborhood or any group gathering that I go to in any Bengali community. Okay, and but then when I started watching UFC, I realized, holy shit, I'm just the lightweight division of UFC. Khabib cut downs to my weight. Okay, Khabib walks around at 190 pounds. He cuts down to 155 pounds. And then above that, there's welterweight. Then above that, there's middleweight. Then light heavyweight. Then heavyweight. Imagine those guys in a fight with us. And we are going on saying, who cares what happens in the West? They do wokeism. We must not do Western style capitalism, etc. We must remain Bhosri ke featherweight division, stunted growth, a country. Lode. And I went to a wedding ceremony a few days back. That family was very, very rags to riches story. Not riches, like rags to middle class story because of 1991 liberalization, but they were again a much poorer family in terms of, because of the partition and stuff. And so a huge bunch of people in that marriage ceremony were like just 5 feet or below. Lots of people in that. So that was one side of the family. So there are old women, men, young guys, women, girls, all of them walking about me with their height just 4.5 feet, 5 feet, 5.5 feet. 5.5 feet is too tall for them. 5 feet, etc. I felt like a giant walking around those Lilliputians. And even their children have a bit of a better height. Their children are like 5 feet 5 and stuff at the best. But the almost entirety of the family was below 5 feet. And we're not going to do Western style capitalism.
What happened was, you had Essential Commodities Act and you were controlling prices for everything, right? Because the economy wasn't large enough. So even middle class people relied on rations. And now when rice gets price controlled, but actually the market price is higher than the control price, what happens is people want to start selling in the black market because that's how the ration shops will make a killing. But if you divert 100% of what goes in the ration shop to the black market, then you're going to have riots, right? People are waiting outside in line, they're going to beat you up. So what they do is, the market price adjusts in the sense that the ration price, let's say, is 20% away from the market price. They will reduce 20% of the weight in rice and include 20% of the weight in something that can pass off as rice.
Ish.
Because it'll add to the weight when you're weighing and measuring and giving a bag of rice to a poor person or to my grandmother or something. So it'll adjust. But when you go home and the grandmother opens that bag, it's still only 80% rice and 20% impurities, except it's all mixed in. So now you need to separate it, right? And the moment liberalization happened, this just went away in a few months or a couple of years.
Wow.
I never saw my grandmother do that ever again in my life. And it's, you just think about this, we're talking nowadays about female labor force participation and how women get trapped at home. Now imagine having to look after a family and raise your kids. And every day you have to spend 2 hours making sure that the dal you're serving them doesn't have stones in them, right?
Yeah.
The whole thing, economists, we just call this deadweight loss. But there's a human cost to this, which is so large and so extraordinary. It's very difficult to express this to someone who's never seen it.
And the only little bit that I want to add to it is that, I was at the IMF on their invitation a few years ago in 2014, I think, if I recall correctly. And I cannot tell you, Shruti, the number of people from the senior IMF management who walked up to me and said that, we take India.
But Sparsh, see their progress in terms of health now in the 90s onwards generations, and see what stuff they are doing in the Olympics, and they have a UFC champion as well. भाई कुछ देश हर चीज में now I don't want to be a Jayant Bhandari here. It's not like we are not doing good at anything, but notice that we are being beaten in a lot of things, of course, but in many random things, absolutely poor countries and rich as fuck countries are beating us often in the very same things. That really pisses me off. Like sports and combat sports and stuff. कि भाई हमारा तो ठीक है गरीबी था एटसेट्रा, तो भिखारी देश, गरीब देश, मिडिल इनकम देश, माउंटेन में रहने वाले गरीब मुसलमान देश, सब कोई कॉम्बैट स्पोर्ट्स में आगे चला जा रहा है. ये कैसे हो रहा है? पूरे दिन तो रास्ते में राइट करना ही सीखा है 80 साल से, फिर भी मारपीट भी करना भी ठीक से कैसे नहीं आता किसी को?
As the poster child of our reforms program, our stabilization programs, and any economy that we go to and we say you need to do this, we give the example of India. And we say that if you do what we are saying, you'll become like India. I mean, that just felt so good. Absolutely. You know, India became one of those textbook cases or case studies that are taught everywhere in the world.
Yeah.
You know, there are two things in
Which is why Thomas Sowell goes on right talking about India repeatedly in countless books.
Indian technocrats have been known to advise the rest of the world on. The first is how we run
ये ठीक से करो, नहीं तो हिंदुस्तान का इकोनॉमी आ जाएगा.
our elections. You know, so if you remember, you know, recently when Bhutan democratized, you know, when Nepal wanted to figure out how to switch to a different kind of ballot system, literally Indian election officers are called there. They train the election commission of that country. They figure out how to run these elections and so on. Another area is vaccine distribution, right? So the Indian administrative system has figured this out so well that so many African countries, I see Indians going and advising. So anytime I meet, you know, colleagues and friends who are coming from African countries to Washington, DC, and, you know, DC is one of those interesting places where everyone from the world in the policy business kind of goes through, right? They always talk about that incredible experience. And the third area, as you said, is how to figure out macroeconomic stability, which is most important pillar. You know, under that umbrella, then you have flexibility and room to do so many other things in the economy. You can't start with digital, you know, public infrastructure. You need to have macro stability first before you can do digital public infrastructure. You need macro stability first and sensible method of raising revenue before you start distributing.
हाँ स्पर्श, ये तो तुम ठीक कह रहे हो, मगर मेरा प्रॉब्लम ये भी है कि हम इतने सारे फालतू के लौड़े के स्पोर्ट्स स्पॉन्सर किए जा रहे हैं, सब्सिडाइज किए जा रहे हैं, जो कि चुतिया कोई नहीं देखता है, और फिर वर्चू सिग्नल किया जाता है सिर्फ ओलंपिक के टाइम कुछ लोगों से, जो लोग खुद नहीं देखते बाकी साल बैठ के. These are the same fuckers who say that BSNL should not be defunded even though they don't use BSNL themselves. तो हम लौड़े के स्पोर्ट्स सब्सिडाइज कर रहे हैं जो कि कोई नहीं देख रहा है, जिसमें कि मारपीट थोड़ा बहुत है, जिसमें कि लोग घुस रहे हैं सिर्फ और सिर्फ रेलवेज की नौकरी के लिए, और हम यूएफसी भी लड़ नहीं पा रहे हैं. और उसके ऊपर लोग बोल रहे हैं कि कलरीपयट्टू वगैरह को रिजुविनेट करो, रीडिस्कवर करके क्या करोगे? उसमें से कौन सा स्किल निकालोगे जो कि आज तुम अंशुल जुबली के ऊपर यूज कर पाओगे?
Distributing toilets, right? So I'm saying it doesn't matter where you are on the spectrum, whether you are on the left, whether you are on the right, whether you are a centrist. You basically need to be part of an economy that can function and pay bills, right? And for that, you need prudent macroeconomic policy, you need prudent monetary policy, you need prudent fiscal policy. And this came in to India only after 1991. And, you know, for all this talk, again, when I speak with my socialist friends, my communist friends, you know, I also went to Delhi University, so I have all the, you know, the spectrum of ideologies that you get in economic sciences. One of the things I always impress upon them is that India's welfare agenda really took off only after 1991, because the union government revenue has increased about 25 times, right? State government revenues have increased about 25 to 30 times. All this in nominal terms, about, you know, 3.5 to 4.5 times in real terms. And only if you can have revenue with the government can we even have a conversation about should we build schools, should we build hospitals, should we give toilets.
Yeah, again, I was going on speaking on mute. So yeah, I was saying that Bengal's martial art is probably Lathi Khala. Lathi Khala is sort of a boiled down and a more primitive and non-evolved version of Kalaripayattu. But again, just like Kalaripayattu, today it has become just a beautiful dance form. It takes a lot of skill, discipline, and fitness, but it translates to absolutely no fight skills at all. And a lot of BJP RSS leaders do this Lathi Khala every time and every now and then to demonstrate the greatness of India's ancient knowledge systems, etc. Many people do the talwar sword fight demonstrations on the streets and stuff. But the people who seem to get beaten up in these fake talwar demonstrations and Lathi Khala and Lathi means danda and Kalaripayattu are just like in karate. They pretend, they act as if they pretend to get beaten up, right? And laymen don't understand this, and they think therefore these actually have some value. But I'm pretty sure that Lathi Khala at point had some value, because people really used it in the villages of Bengal to become the zamindars' hired goons, or to beat up dacoits, or to become dacoits themselves. People actually knew something called the Lathi fight skills set. Today it's become a circus, and Indian martial art should go, yes. तो अब उसको संस्कृत नाम कुछ देना है तो युयुत्सु नाम बोल दो. मैं तो बोल रहा हूँ कि युयुत्सु नाम है महाभारत में, उसको नाम दो. कुछ नाम संस्कृत नहीं देने से अगर तुमको सब कुछ लगता है कि वेस्टर्न प्रोपेगेंडा है तो दो नाम संस्कृत नाम. डू टीएमसी गुंडास यूज दैट मार्शल आर्ट? ऑफन या डंडा तो है ही.
Right? Should we give fertilizer subsidy? Otherwise, the whole question is moot. You have no money to distribute. So even those who are not your
देखो, मार्शल आर्ट के नाम में ही नृत्य घुसा दिया है, तो और वो मार्शल कहाँ रहेगा और सिर्फ आर्ट रह जाएगा, मार्शल नहीं है वो.
typical free market types, I think this liberalization case study as it is, we really need to think carefully about it, because at the core of it, it wasn't about are we ideologically socialists or markets or whatever. At the core of it, it was how do we grow the size of the pie, right? How do you achieve economic growth? Because without economic growth, you can't have any of this. And for economic growth, you need to go back to what, Adam Smith said, law and order, a dispensation of justice, a tolerable taxation. And that's pretty much all you need, right? Now we've added a few more sophisticated things like currencies and macro stability and controlling fiscal deficits and, prudent policies. But that's really at the core of it. And in your book, actually, the reason I enjoy reading your work so much is you and I grew up in that time and with that optimism. And in your book, it's so clear what we lost. Right? I mean, it's literally called the lost decade, but what we lost when we lost the momentum to continue those set of reforms.
Finally.
Because even till the end of the Vajpayee government, till 2004, right? Even though it was not a Congress government, they just continued those reforms, and then Manmohan Singh became Prime Minister again. After acquiring independence and, setting up a constitution and an election commission and so on, I think the next greatest thing we've done in, post-colonial India is the 91 reforms.
Thanks so much, Shruti. That's so well put.
Thank you for having me. This was a pleasure, and hopefully we get to have more conversations about what came after and all the
Secretary and Finance Secretary later, and was.
Yeah. So yes, usually we are going offline with this one. We are coming back live in 9:30 and in 15 minutes. Check out. I've already announced that live stream. We are going to do a live reaction of two of the very, very first Sanjeev Sanya interviews I ever saw. We are going to take a trip down my memory lane. So see you in 15 minutes. Okay. Thank you for joining, guys. Bye bye.
যদি সবাই ফিরে যায় ওরে ওরে ও ভাগা সবাই ফিরে যায় যদি গন পথে যাওয়ার কালে কেউ ফিরে না যায় তবে পথের কাটা তুই রক্ত মাখা চরণ তলে একলা দলরে তুই রক্ত মাখা চরণ তলে একলা দলরে যদি তোর ডাক শুনে কেউ না আসে তবে একলা চলো রে যদি আলো না ধরে ওরে ওরে ও ভাগা আলো না ধরে যদি ঝড় বাদলে আধার রাতে দুয়ার দেয় ঘরে তবে বজ্রানলে আপন বুকের পাঁচ আপন বুকের পাঁজর জ্বালিয়ে নিয়ে একলা চলো রে, যদি তোর ডাক শুনে কেউ না আসে তবে একলা চলো রে। একলা চলো, একলা চলো, একলা চলো, একলা চলো।